Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's extended webinar and AGM. For those who don't know me, my name is Alison Mackay and I am currently the Chair of SCLF and I'll be your host today. I'm also joined by Eve and Stevie backstage who will be helping out with any tech issues and also to help us out with the questions session. Before we get started, I just wanted to remind you that immediately following this webinar, we will be holding a very short, I promise, AGM, and so we'd be very grateful if you could stay on for that to hear about our committee nominations, a wee bit of a review of the past year, and also what we've got planned for the year ahead. So before we get started, just some usual housekeeping. So you'll have joined today on mute and your camera's off, so sit back and relax and enjoy today's session. If you do have to step away, then this webinar is being recorded and so you'll be able to catch up on our YouTube channel later on. We'll be having a Q&A at the end of our 4 speaker presentations today. And so if you have any comments or questions to put to any of our presenters, then if you just put them in the question box, but if you could also, it'd be really helpful if you could just tell us who the question is directed to, and that will just help us manage them later on. And if we don't manage to answer all your questions live, then we will endeavour to try and answer them offline afterwards. And the last bit of housekeeping is just to ask you to please fill in the short feedback form which will appear when you leave the webinar today. And you can also use this form to give us any suggestions for future webinars for next year or to volunteer to contribute to them next year. And there'll be more on that later and where we would like your help. So getting on to today's session, as you know, today is World Soil Day. Soil and water are an essential resource for sustaining life on Earth, and Scotland's soils are an important natural resource. They play an essential part in all of our lives, providing us with a wide range of benefits. Soil and water provide the foundation for our food production, for ecosystems and human well-being. Recognising their invaluable roles, we can take proactive measures to safeguard these resources for future generations. And therefore, today we're exploring how the land contamination sector in Scotland is contributing to sustainable soil management. And I'm delighted to welcome 4 speakers today who are going to provide some of their experiences and perspectives. First, we will have Sarah Hamill, who is a contaminated land officer from West Dunbartonshire Council, who is going to introduce the 10 principles of good soil management. And then we will have a bit of a case study from Hendrik Nollet, project manager at DEME Environmental, on a site which is actually in Sarah's local authority, so that will be a nice joined up couple of sessions. We will then have another case study from Gavin Broomfield, who's a project and contracts manager at VHE Construction. And after a very short 5-minute comfort break, we will also welcome Jonathan Atkinson from CLAIRE, who will introduce the CLAIRE International Soil Passport Declaration under DoWCoP. What I will do is, rather than reading out everybody's bios, I will put our speaker full bios in the chat. But without further ado, I will hand you over to Sarah. If I can get myself organised. Stevie, I should have got you to do this. So I'm just going to make you a presenter just now, Sarah.
Okay.
That should be you.
Show my screen. Just want to find out, is it the right screen? Is that showing you the presentation there?
Yep, just need to do presentation mode and that'll be you.
And then go from the beginning. Hopefully it works. Okay, that should be it then.
Super.
Okay, thanks then. Thanks, Alison. So, thanks everyone. It's always strange sort of doing this on screen, but I've cut my presentation a bit, so I hope I don't go into a coughing fit. But so hopefully I'll get through this fine. But no, as Alison said, they are excuse me, sorry. That's it. As Alison said, they're World Soils Day, and I thought what a great day for a webinar to highlight the importance of our soils and to hear about project initiatives and how, as an industry, we're doing. Thanks, SCLF, for inviting me to talk today. Those that know me or have worked with me will have heard me bang on about the importance of soils, and I do very much feel that we all have a responsibility ensuring that it is managed better. As Alison said, today I've been asked to discuss the Society Environment's 10 principles of good soils and stones management, but also to briefly introduce what we are doing in West Dunbartonshire Council to look to implement some of these. Before I go on to introducing the 10 principles, I just want to provide a brief introduction that I think further highlights the importance of the Society Environment work. I attended a recent IES webinar recently, and they discussed the global poly crisis. I'm not going to go into this in any more detail, as somebody far more knowledgeable than me could do that, but I did take a lot from this and found that a lot of what was discussed ties into today's presentation. Too often, the importance of our soils and stones are disregarded, and while everyone freely talks about sustainability, what it still comes down to is money. And we all agree sustainable development is a great concept. However, there are 17, as we know, 17 sustainable development goals. But despite this, there is one that seems to get priority, and that's economic growth. And I think if we were to ask everyone to name 5 of the goals, I wouldn't be surprised if economic growth would be one of them. But what about the other 16? I totally understand. I'm not naive, not complete sort of naive that it is an important indicator for economic growth. But if we are to truly achieve sustainable development, then we need to remember the other 16. And a key message that I took from the IES webinar was that we all need to get better at thinking about long-term issues. Despite the increased awareness about the climate emergency, I feel that as a generation, we still tend to focus on the short term. And another point that came from the webinar was the key to success is effective preparedness. And by doing this, we have a far better chance of achieving economic growth as well as a lot of the other sustainable development goals. The ones I'm highlighting here, I think, are the ones that us in the contaminated land quality sector could probably look to kind of focus a bit more on. And, just a few of them here. We've got climate action, sustainable cities and communities, affordable and clean energy, good health and well-being, and as Alison mentioned as well, life on land and life below water. We have an opportunity, I think, by just being a bit more prepared and thinking a bit more long-term to achieve all of this. So in other words, achieve sustainable economic growth, which brings me nicely onto the work the Society Environment has been doing. So just a bit of an introduction. I had the opportunity to join the Society Environment Soils and Stones Regulated and Governance Task Group. It's a mouthful. The group members included representatives from various sectors across the UK, and I represented not just the local authority regulator, but I was the only Scottish representative. Jonathan, who's speaking later, was also sat in the group, and so I'll thank him in advance for allowing me to use some of his slides. I'm obviously aware, the management and handling of soils and stones are handled differently both north and south of the border. So at the start, I wasn't sure as to how much I could offer, but it was very clear early on that the entire task group had the same vision, which is to drive change to ensure that soils and stones are managed better, no matter where you are. And the output from the task group was the publication of 10 principles of good soils and stones management. These provide a common framework to underpin a circular, sustainable economy, while encouraging us all to think longer term and to think about the long-term preparedness that I referred to earlier. The principles cover all sectors and so address more than just land quality. But I think as contaminant land practitioners, we can look at all 3 of these principles and look to apply them all. And for anybody that's not seen, I haven't put an example up of the principles, but there's a link there to them. And I really encourage you to look there at the principles that were produced, because they're not just for England, they can be applied across the nations. As I said, the principles apply to anybody who really is involved in land. So whether you work in agriculture or forestry or the leisure sector, whether you're involved in construction or regulation, contaminated land, many of us are, or also whether you're a soil practitioner or just dealing with waste management or landscaping, then the principles can be applied by everybody. And I think, if we all do our bit, then we should be able to properly achieve sustainable economic growth. And I don't deny that there's far more to this than land quality, and I think while we could all sit back and wait for somebody else to take action, wouldn't it be better if we all identified the principles associated with our sector, our roles, and did our best to make the necessary changes, no matter how big or small? The next few slides will discuss further two of the principles that I believe that as a contaminant land officer that I can look to hopefully progress. And the first of these is Principle 6. This is one of the principles which, as a regulator, I do promote. It's frustrating, you know, often developers come to speak to the council, but they don't speak to us. So pre-project meetings with other council departments to discuss layout or design in order to come up with a vision for a site. And it's all about how it looks at the end. The new Scottish planning framework, as you're sure all aware, NPF4, is all about making places livable, productive and sustainable. But if we are to achieve proper sustainable places, then we need to be willing to consider it from the ground up. Too often we see sites levelled. However, should we not be first looking to make use of existing topography to avoid large-scale earthworks? I understand there'll be times when this is needed, but to at least include this as an idea in the early design stage is key, rather than assuming everything needs to be flat. I think we've a long way, since thinking of a flat earth. But in practice in West Dunbartonshire, we do promote early engagement, and this has been successful at some of our sites. I'm not going to deny we've still got some way to go when it comes to some all our sites, but we will, and I personally will persevere, as it has been shown to pay off. And again, it's that effective preparedness again. The other principle, which I think definitely applies in our sector, is Principle 7. The initial plan when working on the principles was to include an infographic as part of the notes, but it was felt it was a bit too prescriptive, and so it was taken out. But there are notes for each of the principles that go into a bit more detail and explains more what this refers to. I think the biggest bugbear of mine is often we see material being excavated because it's not geotechnically suitable. We then have the issue of this then having been assessed to find a suitable use, or worst case, a use being found irrespective of risk. But with a bit more attention, it could be that this material could be treated in situ, and therefore no need for large-scale excavations in the first place. And I think the other thing is that with a bit more thinking, different material can be used for different purposes. The problem arises when the end use has not been properly defined, and so all material needs to comply with the most sensitive end use. And as a regulator, we're often accused of being the ones that expect the soil to be of the best quality. But the reasons for that is because people aren't willing to put a bit of effort into where the material is going to be used. So we have to assume the most sensitive end use. So, but wouldn't it be better to manage, if a bit more thought about management and handling of materials would mean that different soils could be segregated for different uses? So in practice, in West Dunbartonshire, we address this through specific planning conditions, and we have one for what's termed remediation scheme. Some people call it implementation plan, or a material management condition. So the reason for the remediation scheme is some people ask, is that not the strategy? But we're finding that more detail is required and tends to be included in a strategy. Not only that, sometimes the strategy is prepared, but the detail is not yet known. And we also tend to find that who should provide the scheme is not the consultant, but more likely the contractors. So this condition then means that we can agree a high-level strategy, but then have the detail provided later on, and also more importantly by those who will actually be doing the work. It also ensures all contractors are aware of the strategy, and so know in advance what has already been agreed. So for earthworks, this can be a simple letter, you know, if it doesn't need to be anything onerous, or for more large-scale earthworks, you might need a more detailed method statement. And the other condition we have, which we use, is one for material management. This relates specifically to the import and reuse of material. At some sites, there's not always a need for a strategy, so this is very important for those sites. Or at others, as I said, it could be that a large-scale earthworks are proposed, and so a more detailed earthwork strategy is required. it can be done at an earlier stage, and some of our larger sites we have this agreed in advance. It then means there's more time to think about what is needed and where, and therefore allows a resource hierarchy for the management of land, soils and stones, as Principle 7 kind of allows. So I'd really encourage everyone to look at the 10 principles and to identify where they think they can make a difference. So by way of conclusion, I bring you back to my rather bizarre title, which was Mountains or Molehills. The fact of the matter is, it doesn't matter. No matter how much soils and stones we're dealing with, we need to remember that it is a resource in its own right. And as a fellow colleague once said, we need to stop treating it like dirt. I hope I've demonstrated how I'm trying to make a difference in West Dunbartonshire, and would encourage others to do the same. And while globally our approach may be negligible, and even nationally we've still a long way to go, having webinars like this I think is a great way to spread the word, and so I hope I've managed to provide you all with some food for thought as to what we in the contaminated land sector can look to do. But I do, however, believe our changes are making a difference locally, which brings us on nicely to the next speaker, which is Hendrik Nollet, who can take you through a fantastic example of sustainable management of soils at our former oil terminal site here in West Dunbartonshire. So thanks for listening, and as I said, it was slightly shorter. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. That was great for setting the scene. And as you say, we're going to hear about some of those things at the coalface, as it were. Not that it was a coal site, but so I'm just going to make Hendrik a presenter. And just remember, everyone, if you've got any questions for any of our presenters, just stick them in the questions channel. And we will try and get Hendrik's screen. That's you. If you go slideshow, you're good to go. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to present the remediation project that we are currently working on. It's a project that is still in full swing, so it's not yet completed. And it's the remediation of a former oil terminal. And I was asked actually today to talk a little bit about the on-site treatment that we are doing of the remediation works. So first of all, a little bit an overview. So I will introduce you to the project, focus on the treatment technique, that the soil washing plant that we have on site, and as well focus on the data management system we have on site. Questions are not immediately for after this presentation. I was informed that it's after the 4th session, so don't worry. First of all, introduction. So the scope of work of the remediation project we are currently working on. It's a former oil terminal, so of course the soils are contaminated with hydrocarbons. We can find as well some asbestos in the soil. It's rather localized, and in the top 60 centimeter to 1 meter, so it's limited, that one. The biggest challenge we have, and you've seen already some pictures, the site is just next to the river Clyde. So it's a river that is influenced by the tide. As you can see, the tide or the level of the water, groundwater on site fluctuates between 0.3 and 4.9 meter below ground level, which is significant. And when they were doing the site investigation, they found as well some free phase during the site investigation. So the principal objective for the remediation is that we need to remediate the site to commercial end use. The remediation strategy, it's a remediation strategy that is risk-based, aims to reuse 90% of more of all the soils that we excavate and treat. The focus is mainly on source removal. So we are excavating the soils and we are treating them ex situ, but ex situ on site. And we focus as well, as mentioned already before, on the recovery of free phase on this project. Here you can see a timeline of the project. It's not only to document that such a development of such a project takes a long time. So the investigation started in 1991, and we will complete the remediation works in the beginning of 2024. But actually, Sarah mentioned as well, what I want to zoom in is mainly on the phase just before contract signing. Often today, contractors receive actually the tender documents. We have to price them. There are some discussions with the client, and hopefully we come then to contract signing. This project is slightly different. In this project, actually, we were awarded an ECI phase contract, so an early contractor involvement. What is now, I think a lot of you are aware about early contractor involvement. It's the involvement in the design of the project of the contractor, and we are working then together with the consultant and the client and looking for the best way how to remediate the sites. So for example, our examples are that we support the client with volume calculation. We as a contractor are really putting a lot of focus on evidence-based remediation. What do I want to say with that is that we want to prevent as much as possible subjective criteria, because in this project we had as well a visual criterion. But if we are together walking on site, for you soil will be clean, for me it will be dirty, and the other way around. So we want to make the criteria as objective as possible. So we were developing as well in the ECI phase some additional testing to make those criteria objective as possible. We presented them as well to the authorities for approval. On site, we have a hard criterion, which is for us about 9,600. And as mentioned, we had as well a visual criterion. But by defining and developing the leaching test, we can actually now, based on doing the test, we decide if a certain soil matrix needs to be treated or not. And last but not least is actually we supported as well the client with choosing the optimal treatment technique for the works on site. So we've done additional testing on site. And from those data, we could see that the pollution was mainly linked actually to soils containing up to 23% of fines. So for us, that was really the fingerprint and the proof that a soil wash technique might and was the best or the ideal technique actually on this project for the treatment of the soils. Of course, we can promise a lot during the early contractor involvement, but during the execution, we need to verify and we need to validate and we need to demonstrate that our processes, our procedures that we developed, that they are working and that they are working well. So for us, we have on this remediation project an on-site lab where we have continuously 2 to 3 full-time equivalents people working in it. I call it my R&D department. They are really the heart of the project. So they are doing the sampling, they are performing the test, they are providing the operational team with the data, allowing us actually to decide in the evening or during the day what we need to do with the soils, if we need to treat them or what we have to do. At the end of the ECI, ideally you come up with a treatment process, and here I try to summarize the treatment process. So for this project, we split up the complete site into a grid of 20 by 20 meters. So we are excavating the complete site in grid cells of 20 by 20. And we are bringing the excavated soils to a platform where we store the materials in stockpiles of about 100 cubic. We take then samples and we analyze the materials, first of all, for asbestos. If the asbestos concentration is above 0.1% in this case, we dispose them of those materials are disposed. Other materials are reused on site. We are doing as well the chemical classification. So based on chemical classification, we decide what soils will need to be treated, and we are treating them in the soil wash plant. Here as well on this project, we have an additional criterion and criterion linked with the geotech. So we have as well a plant on site that allows us to stabilize materials if they are not okay to be reused or backfilled. And finally, of course, we are backfilling the materials on site. Here, the coming slide are some pictures actually of the remediation project. On this picture, you can see that it's rather a big site we are working on. The total surface of the site is 60 hectares, including mudflats, but about 20 hectares are subject to remediation. You can see here in the front our platform where we store all the stockpiles and as well where the treatment plants are constructed. In the beginning of 2022, we started with the remediation of the western part of the site. So you can see here a picture of that part. Here you see a picture somewhere at the end of 2022, beginning of 2023, where we were mainly focusing on the eastern part of the site of the remediation works of the eastern part. And this is now a picture of, let's say, very recently, maybe 4 or 5 weeks old. This is how the site looks today. So today we are mainly focusing on the remaining part of the eastern part remediation, and as well the remediation of the revetment and the old quay wall. So we are excavating the complete structure and are reconstructing a new revetment wall. Zooming in now into the soil wash plant, what is it, or what you have seen this figure already. So based on this figure, we decided that soil washing was the ideal technique. And why? Because soil washing is actually nothing else than a separation technique. 95% is actually based on the separation of particle sizes. So basically we're taking a soil and we are screening it, and we are recovering gravel, sand, and the finer fraction, which is the silt and the clay fraction. We have as well some units which are focusing on density, units that are removing the ferrous materials. And as well, you have then some processes, but those are minor. It's absorption, abrasion, and dissolution. So if you look now to the process, here is a picture actually of the plant itself on site. So you can here see the soil wash plants. It's all modular units, so we can bring them to every site that you are busy with remediation. So this is the soil wash plant, and you see here in the back as well a rather big water treatment plant, a treatment plant that can deal with about 200 cubic per hour. Zooming in into the process itself. So if we have a stockpile 100 cubic that we say chemically now we need to soil wash it or we need to treat it. So the material is brought first into an input hopper. An input hopper where the material is then conveyed by conveyor belts into a wet screen unit. On top of the conveyor, we have a magnetic belt where we are removing the ferrous materials. Materials coming onto the wet screen, the materials that stays on top of the wet screen, that's the bigger sizes, that's the gravel. The gravel is then going here then to the gravel washer. And of course, the result from the gravel washing process is clean gravel. By washing the gravel, often we see that organics are linked to the stones or small roots or whatever we find into the matrix. So here we have then a dewatering screen where we recover the organics. Meanwhile, all the fines, so the sand fraction, the silt fraction, and the clay fraction that is going here underneath the sump of the wet screen is pumped to a hydrocyclone. A hydrocyclone actually is then separating the sand and the silt fraction. The sand fraction is going or is pumped to an upstream clarifier. It's actually a polishing step where we are removing the last fines that are sticking to the sand fraction. And then the sand is pumped over a dewatering screen to dewater it, and we have then clean sand. The fine fraction, the silt and the clay fraction, are pumped to a lamellus separator. It's a very big tower, and we are using some polymers to make some flocks, allowing to settle into the lamellus separator. And from the bottom of the lamellus separator, we are pumping the materials to a dewatering unit. That can be a belt press, it can be a chamber filter press, but for this project we've chosen for a decanter centrifuge. So there we generate then what we call filter cakes. And as you will see in the next slide, those are roughly the output materials of the plant we have. So we have clean gravel and clean sand, and we have then the pollution which is up concentrated in the fine fraction, the silt and the clay fraction, which we call then filter cakes, this fraction needs to be disposed of and cannot be reused on site. And we have the water, of course, and it's a lot of water that is pumped through the installation, but that water is treated on site before it's pumped or discharged into the River Clyde. If you look to the reuse, what is the impact? About 23% is filter cakes and needs disposal, but we can reuse 10 to 15% of the gravel. So that's the matrix that goes in. And the biggest part actually of the material that goes in is the sand fraction. So that's 60 to 67%. Summarizing this in a few numbers, on-site treatment. So we treated up till now, and by the end of the project, it will be about 150,000 tons of materials. If we would have transported that off-site for off-site treatment of disposal, that would correspond to about 6,000 trucks, but we were able to keep them on site and treat them on site. Focusing on the treatment efficiency, it's more than 90%. What do I mean with treatment efficiency? The material that we put into the system has a concentration between 5,000 and 40,000 milligram TPH per kilogram. The quality that comes out of the plants is in the hundreds of milligram per kilogram. So as mentioned already, you saw that in the previous slide that we need to dispose of about 23%. So of the soil wash material, we can recover and reuse about 77%. And if you look to the overall mass balance, because we have to excavate as well some clean materials before we reach contaminated or polluted ones, the overall mass balance on site shows at this moment that we are reusing about 90 to 93% of the materials that we excavate, which is quite significant. Now focusing a little bit on the data management. It's a long project, it's a big project. It's a project of about 2.5 years. So we are excavating quite some soils, about 475,000 tons. We are backfilling as well, 240,000 tons. We are soil washing, or we will soil wash about 130 at the end of the project. We are stabilizing about 90,000 tons, treating water as well, and now about 330,000 cubic. So that means a lot of streams that we have to handle and a lot of streams that we have to control on site. So that implies a rather thorough data management system. If we look actually, if we look to the project, we will take approximately 5,000 samples. We will execute 20,000 tests, issue about 12,000 reports, and on the whole project, we have about 30,000 registration. What is a registration? It's actually an entry into the data system that we have. So all this requires a lot of discipline, and a lot of discipline that needs to start actually already from the preparation phase of the project. So what we are doing actually, if we are starting up the project in the preparation phase, we are translating all our processes that we have on site into a flowchart. We check as well what inputs and outputs we have into the system, and we arrange already unique labels, unique codes for every input and output. How does it look then during the operational phase? Here you see a schematics of how the data management system is working. I mentioned before that you are excavating in grids of about 20 by 20 meter. Each excavator has a GPS system, so he knows perfectly in which grid he is. That information he gives to the dumper driver, and the dumper driver gets as well information about the quality that the excavator operator is excavating. All that information is captured and collected. If the dumper is full, he drives to the platform. First of all, he's passing by the weighbridge, so we are registering as well for every movement, the weight of the material. And as mentioned, we are sampling the materials in stockpiles of 100 cubic. So if we reach 100 cubic in a stockpile, the dumper operator gets the message that the stockpile is full, that the stockpile is closed, and then a unique code, a unique label is generated for that stockpile. At that moment, the R&D department receives as well a message that they should come to the platform to do the sampling, perform this sampling for then the further chemical analysis. So all the data that we collect from the chemical analysis, both from our on-site lab as well from the external lab, because all the validation, sampling and testing needs to be done by a third party. We cannot do that on site. All that information is collected in our database and recorded. In addition, as well, all the treatment processes. So if you are doing, for example, if a stockpile needs to be soil washed, you saw that we generate roughly 3 fractions, gravel, sand, and fines. All those fractions are generated and we keep track of them. With all that information, we are preparing then reports. So if the material from a stockpile complies with the site reuse criteria, of course, that material is then reused and comes back to be backfilled. We follow and trace as well where the materials are backfilled. Material that is not in compliance with the site reuse criteria are disposed of, but at this moment this is very limited. This is a rather intensive and an extensive data management system, but it allows us to demonstrate full traceability and as well allows us to provide actually documentation both to the client and to the authorities in a transparent way. So this is again a summary of the data management system. So as mentioned, field workers and R&D engineers are giving input into a data management or a database system. As well, my works manager, they are providing information, but important as well, they can get as well information from the system. For example, production, other dashboards that are important for the production. The system as well generates or helps us generating quite some reports that documents quality and what we are doing towards the client. And last but not least as well, it helps us as well with the reporting and with the as-built information towards the regulator and eventual buyer of the site. The data management system, so what information can we get out of it? So it helps us to monitor the progress on site. So all the data are converted into an ARCGIS or a QGIS system where we can follow up then the progress of the remediation works. It allows us to trace all the streams we have on site. In practice, if somebody comes on site and he sees a stone laying on site, we must be able actually almost to say from where we excavated that stone, on which date it was excavated, the grit, the depth, what has been done with that stone, has it been treated, not been treated, so the complete history or the life cycle, let's say, of the material. We are generating as well quite some reports on a daily basis. Reports, what we call pile reports. Pile reports is actually some kind of an ID of all the stockpiles we have on site. So every pile has a unique report demonstrating its chemical quality. And we are generating as well reports from the quality, let's say, of the excavation base and the excavation slopes. That's more in the context of our validation that we completed the remediation works in certain areas. And last but not least, of course, the dashboards which are very important for us. It allows us to follow up production, to monitoring certain parameters, like, for example, excavation rate. But this information is shared as well with the client, as well with the regulator and authorities. And for example, here you see a dashboard, which is important for the client because it defines how much, or it demonstrates or shows how much fines or filter cake we are producing at a certain moment, because this is, of course, a rather expensive output. So that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
That was great. Thank you very much, Hendrik. It's great to see that site actually progressing so well. I was brought up not very far from there at all. So yeah, it's great to see. So next up, we've got Gavin. Just 1 minute, Gavin, I'll get you made a presenter.
No problem.
That should be you. No. You should be able to try and share your screen.
That should be me now, is it?
Not quite.
Yeah, that's visible.
Right, am I just not seeing it for some reason?
Everybody got that?
I can't see it for some reason, I don't know why.
I can see the slides, we can't see Gavin.
Yeah, he's not got his...
Yeah, I'm struggling with Scottish Borders internet, so I don't have a camera on. So as long as you can see the sides, that's the main thing.
Yeah, I can see
as long as
That's
As long as everybody else can see it, I can't. So, okay, go ahead.
Fine. Thanks to Sarah and Hendrik. You've both managed to pretty much keep to time, which is fantastic. So when I did a run through of my presentation earlier on, it was a little bit over. So I'll try and cut it shorter. Fortunately, I don't have to do much of an intro to myself if the biographies are going to be shared. So slightly different, I suppose, to Hendrik's presentation. Hendrik's was obviously based on reuse of soils on the site of origin. I'm going to focus more on using soils on sites other than the site of origin. So 3 case studies. I will unapologetically use 3 gas holders that we've completed recently: Paisley, Glasgow and Edinburgh. Mainly due to the fact that for those of you who are perhaps unfamiliar with gas holders, they do, when we start to decommission and clean up these legacy sites, they do generally leave a very, very large void behind. To give an example, Glasgow, as the biggest holder of the 3 here, is 82 meters diameter, 15.5 meters deep down to the base. So that's giving you nearly 200,000 tons of fill material to fill the hole it left over. When we get to the end, I'll explain a little bit about the comparisons between the sites, why we used the different processes and different legislative frameworks to bring the infill into the site. I'll cover over the challenges, and then probably tying in with some of the points that Sarah raised about the reuse of soils, things that we could do better to help facilitate doing these things rather than using quarried products to infill them. Before we sort of start on the projects, I just thought it was worthwhile for those who perhaps aren't as familiar with the anatomy of a gas holder as they might be. These are predominantly below ground gas holders. You'll see in the picture on the top left-hand side of the screen, we have a frame structure that sits above ground. In all 3 of these cases, these frames were actually listed as part of our industrial heritage, which does add an element of complexity to filling the holder because we have that frame to work around. You have then within the holder, as you can see in this picture, a large sort of domed structure in the center of the holder, which is called a dumpling, and then an area around the outside of that dumpling, which we call an annulus. So I thought it was worth explaining some of these terms so that as I use them as part of the presentation, nobody thinks I'm talking about my dinner tonight. We are talking about the structure of the holder. So that gives you an idea of what they look like before we start to take them apart. Moving on to Paisley, I've run through Paisley first for a couple of reasons. First, sort of chronologically, this was the first of the projects that was undertaken. And secondly, and probably more importantly, this, I suppose, highlights how things are done when timescales are tight. We weren't able to probably use as much recycled material as we wanted to achieve the client's objectives. I will apologize, I'm going to run a time-lapse video to let you see the process, which is then obviously explains the process on the later holders. So it jumps around a little bit. This project was undertaken and ran into COVID lockdowns, so we had to do some clever editing of months and months of inactivity. But I'll run this just now. and this will give you an idea of the process. So we start on the top of the gas holder by removing a small section of the roof. You can see that just up in the top left, and can then start to infill a ramp. Because the frame is listed, we can't access the outside of the holder all the way round about. So the roof is taken off in sections, processed on the top of the dumpling. Then we take the walls down, and they're obviously 3 or 4 lifts. These are big telescopic structures. That material, scrap and generally contaminated timber is all processed, sorted and taken out. We then start the operation to clean the base of the annulus so that it's ready for the infill. We then start to use the long reach excavator to start placing the infill, and obviously it's a fairly slow, delicate operation. This holder was done over probably working period about 3 or 4 months. So the material's brought in, filled up to level with the top of the dumpling, and then we start to construct the second ramp to allow us to take that first ramp out, clean the material underneath there, and then fill off to the top. So you can see some of the remnants at the top right there. Once that's done, the balance of the holder is filled in, and then we put a capping layer on top to leave a space that's usable for the client, or in this case, the site was sold. This site was predominantly done with quarried infill. When you see the little table I have at the end, you'll see. So mainly buying virgin quarried products, which is not really obviously what we're thinking that these should be done like. Moving on to Glasgow. Glasgow was slightly different. We didn't undertake the demolition ourselves. A demolition contractor came in prior to us. What we had in Glasgow was a clay dumpling rather than a concrete one, as you saw in the last one. And as part of the demolition activity, that dumpling had actually collapsed. So some work had been done. The top left photograph there shows that's high energy impact compaction. So we're trying to consolidate material within the dumpling to get us a suitable base to work off, which then takes us to the second picture up on the top right there. So that gives us, we like to fill these with a slightly domed structure so that they will shed water to the sides, and we don't end up with a very large swimming pool that gathers it so we can pump it out. So that's really preparation of the surface to allow the infill. We then process the infill, compact it before putting a capping layer on top and leaving a nice slightly domed surface to take on. This project, slightly differently from Paisley, there wasn't a purchaser for the site at the end, so we had time on our side. So the material into this site was actually brought in under a waste management license rather than a paragraph 19, which meant that I'll discuss the differences between the different frameworks later, but it allowed us to use waste material to fill the entirety of the holder. So we sourced that waste material, those waste soils, from a variety of sites, really sort of M8 corridor and out as far as Greenock. What became quite apparent is that actually, in terms of the reuse of soils, there's only a certain distance that soils will travel before people deem it uneconomical. So while the furthest site there was just short of 25 miles away, the bulk of our material, circa 90% of it, came from other brownfield redevelopment sites within 3 miles of where we were looking to fill. So the advantage we had there, as I said, was that we were able to undertake the licensing, which meant that we could fill the entirety of the holder with effectively surplus and waste soils from other sites, which was obviously a model that we should be looking to recreate. Moving on to Edinburgh, this is a project that we're currently involved with at the moment. We're hopefully, fingers crossed, we see some decent dry weather and can get this finished off, but we've about 2 or 3 weeks further to go to fill this site in. Slightly different on this site in that we've had a lot of site-derived materials that have allowed us to infill the bulk of the gas holder. Some negotiation was required with SEPA beforehand. Effectively, the Greater Granton Gasworks site had a number of stockpiles on which fell out with the red line boundary for this particular development of the gas holder itself. So they had been there for a considerable period of time. There was questions as to whether they would be deemed an off-site source, and therefore waste management licensing would be needed on the site to use them. But through discussions with SEPA, we managed to reach agreement that no, they were suitable for use without falling under any waste management licensing. We have de-risked those stockpiles by putting a paragraph 19 exemption in place, and we've done that in a slightly different manner. So rather than actually using waste soils from other construction sites, where knowing that we were going to be filling through sort of November, December, that market is traditionally very quiet. What we did was we've gone, for those of you who can remember back to Hendrik's slides, the press fines that were coming off Hendrik's soil wash process. We have a number of sites that we discuss within Scotland where, as part of processing secondary aggregates from construction waste, they generate clean press fines, which we have then been able to take in and use. So to date, we've had probably about 5,000–6,000 tons of those materials that we've diverted as a byproduct of producing secondary aggregates to take into and fill the gas holders with. So it's very good for us. It gives us a fairly consistent feed material, and it also gives us certainty of supply, which at this time of the year we would perhaps struggle with from the general construction industry. In terms of the three projects, as I said, Paisley was very much driven by the client's requirements. They had a purchaser for the site. It was a fairly small, relatively speaking, holder. We only needed just short of 13,000 cubes of material to fill it. So we did put a paragraph 19 in place to maximise, if we could, the reuse of waste soils from other sites. But what we found was, partly I suspect driven by COVID, but also partly by the materials that were available in the marketplace at the time, we struggled to get suitable recycled or imported materials from other sites. So ended up a very large percentage of the material that went into that holder was primary quarried material. Glasgow, as we said, was done under a full waste management license, so we were able to fill the entirety of the holder bar the capping layers with recycled material. The capping layer itself was a recycled 6F5, and the sort of a couple of hundred cubes of material that we imported to do the project were really just where we needed more robust stone for repairing haul roads and constructing ramps, and then that final dressing surface that we saw. Much the same way at Edinburgh under a paragraph 19, we've used recycled imports. That 26,700 figure obviously includes stockpiled material, but we would anticipate about 11,000 cubes of off-site derived recycle import. And again, the quarried materials are really just for where we have to use products to shore up the ramps to make them suitable for vehicle transport down into the holder, or in Edinburgh's case, a starter layer at the base of the annulus just to get us out of the water. So they're the sort of differences between the three holders. In terms of the challenges, as I'm sure everybody would like to see, analysis assessment of the source sites. Very often we were being sent site investigation data, things of that nature, and actually in disposal terms it really meant that we had a lot of parameters that weren't covered. We generally had leachability criteria applied, so that was something that was very often not done at the source sites. So on a couple of occasions, we had the flexibility, we had the time to actually get further analysis done, but on a couple of the sources where the window of actually obtaining the material was so narrow, we effectively had to take that at risk and to base our decision making on the analysis we had, and then fill in the gaps as the material came in and got placed. The 2 meter thickness allowable under a paragraph 19 does present a challenge when infilling gas holders. That's probably increased by the nervousness out there from the regulators about placing waste material at a depth. With gas holders, it's not quite so much of an issue, because to maximize the volume under that 2 meter thickness, we would generally place material above the top of the dumpling, which is then shallower. But certainly that is an impediment to filling the entirety of these void spaces, and on another site where you are perhaps excavating material and had infill requirements, that the 2 meter cap can put a limit on the volume that you can import under a paragraph 19. The waste management license that we used in Glasgow, obviously, as I said before, it allowed us to use waste materials to fill the entirety of the holder, but we found there was a significantly longer time frame. So the application process is 3 months, 4 months, rather than a month for a paragraph 19, and the surrender process at the end of that licensing period to hand the license back. A paragraph 19 is basically signed off as the project finishes, where we're in the final stages of surrendering the license at the moment for Glasgow, but that's taken probably in the region of 6 to 9 months, despite having a sort of substantial amount of the content of that surrender application pre-agreed with SEPA. And the final challenge was actually the quality of the material, as Sarah sort of covered in her presentation. You know, Principle 6 and Principle 7 material on a lot of these donor sites was seen as a waste. It wasn't particularly well managed. A lot of the stockpiling, for example, was done in a way that the material was getting very, very wet, which not particularly significant if it was going to landfill, but to allow its reuse as an engineering fill made it quite difficult to justify. So we had a number of false starts with sites whereby the material looked from analysis and geotech testing done at site investigation stage like it was going to be suitable, but when we actually started to look at materials coming from the site in as dug stockpiles, they were just too wet and couldn't be placed. In terms of what we could do better then, and sort of finalising, none of these will be a shock to anybody, but obviously that initial site assessment. So once sites have determined that they have an excess of material and are going to have to remove material from site, having an eye on what are the disposal options, what am I likely to do, rather than just hoping that disposal points or reuse centres will be able to take it based on the assessment they have, is very important. Project timing, you know, we are talking about large scale earthworks, and while project timing can't always be controlled, obviously attempts to do these things in periods of drier weather can greatly increase the chances of being able to use materials as an engineering fill rather than having to send them off to landfill. So that's very important. Regulatory discussion, it'll be music to Sarah's ears to hear me say as a contractor that that dealing with the regulators is and getting them on board with what we're looking to do has been vital, certainly in the later two of the case studies. And I mentioned SEPA here because as the body licensing the operations that we've undertaken, we found the application process in Glasgow was fairly slow the first time around as they came on board with what we were doing. But certainly then down the line, as we moved into Edinburgh, we were dealing with the same people. They knew the process, were much more on board with it, and far smoother. And that has made the process as we finish off these sites far easier. And finally, the management of soils on site. We talked about the moisture content earlier on, and the improper stockpiling or poorly stockpiled materials, but equally so, we found that on a lot of these sites that people had obviously seen a pile of what they considered waste soil, so it had become a dumping ground for the scrapings from wet haul roads. We would get Harris fence panels, we would get Harris feet, bits of timber, all of this kind of stuff that wasn't present when these things had been stockpiled. So there's an education piece there in terms of considering these soils as an asset and something that we're looking to reuse rather than just a waste material to be sending off site. So a few takeaway points, but that's me. I think we're having a break now, Alison, aren't we? And then questions. So
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much, Gavin, for that. Yeah, I think we'll just have a quick 5-minute comfort break. So if we can aim to be back here at 4:10, and then we can continue with our next presentation, which is from Jonathan. So if you just stay on the line, but step away for 5 minutes, grab a coffee, and we'll see you back at 10:10. Thank you. Okay, so welcome back, everyone. Our final speaker of today is Jonathan Atkinson. So I'll just let him get on with it, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end. So remember to put your questions in the question box. Over to you, Jonathan.
Okay, I hope everybody can hear me all right. I'm Jonathan Atkinson. I'm Technical Director at CLAIRE, which is based down in Reading, but we cover across a wide range of area. And basically, you'll read in my bio that until this time last year, I was actually an officer in the Environment Agency, which I had been for many years since it first began. Prior to that, I was in Kent Waste Regulation Authority, so long background as a regulator, but also working on the definition of waste code of practice from its inception, really, both from within the EA and now obviously working at CLAIRE. I just wanted to give you an overview of the definition of waste code of practice, which is an example of how materials can be brought into the circular economy, how best practice can enable that, and how managing that best practice approach is the key really to enabling folk to use materials under the DoWCoP scheme rather than necessarily having to have permits for waste management activities. So I'm hopefully going to find a way of moving the slides forward. So yeah, it's all about managing materials under relevant lines of evidence, and in many countries there are mechanisms to allow the reuse of materials, as we've heard today to some extent, from construction and excavation activities, and that's really important, and the material management and transfer between sites can also be a key thing to the circular economy approach. But generally, these quite often only for clean, naturally occurring soil and stones. They can, perhaps for site of origin activities, use brownfield soils, as we've heard about today, and washed and cleaned aggregates. However, to fit that in to the circular economy and to take a light touch to the regulatory regime and use a system like DoWCoP, you need very clear lines of evidence to ensure that you've got a robust approach and good practice in using materials. Otherwise, if we don't have those lines of evidence, we either have illegal activity or poor practice can blur the line between illegal activity and reuse of materials under the circular economy. And then we can end up with situations which are certainly not beneficial for the environment and potentially harmful to human health as well. So it's key that we sort of work together under a best practice approach. The purpose and scope of DoWCoP was initially set up to enable soils reuse on predominantly brownfield sites, to enable the brownfield regeneration that was pushed for in the early 90s and through the 2000s. Dealing with some of those issues that we had, certainly with paragraph 19s and then other types of permit. And the Environment Agency actually developed the original definition of waste code of practice for greenfield and brownfield sites in 2006. And then that was brought forward by Claire, acting on behalf of industry, to bring forward version 1 of what we now know as the DoWCoP, and then version 2 subsequently in 2011-12. It's based on your land quality assessment process, so what we call in England the land condition risk management framework that's published by the Environment Agency. This is similar to similar schemes across Europe and indeed elsewhere in Australia and so on, where you have a death study, a site investigation, remediation strategies we've heard about today, and then earthwork strategies and so on. But they're done under a risk-based approach rather than just a hazard or waste-based approach. And certainly the DoWCoP is all about good practice, but as I mentioned earlier, key is marshalling those lines of evidence to show that you've got clear audit trail, that you're not discarding materials, so you're not dealing with waste materials. You're aligning to the Waste Framework Directive requirements, which are to ensure that you've got protection of the environment and no harm to human health and no detriment to amenity and so on. But you're doing that with these tracking systems all the way through. So, it's key that you have good quality desk studies, that you have relevant conceptual site model, that you characterize the sites properly. You do the relevant risk assessment. Under the DoWCoP, it's either a route A, which is for contaminated materials, or route B for clean, naturally occurring materials. You do the relevant risk assessments to the relevant level. If you've got land affected by contamination, then you're using a route A. You develop a remediation strategy. If it's a greenfield site that you might be developing, then you would use what we call route B, which is where you're doing a design statement and an earthwork strategy, rather than a remediation strategy and implementation plan. Your materials plan is important. That includes all the sort of relevant background information from the first 3 stages, including your planning permissions and stuff like that, and your cut and fill and processing transfer places. But the key thing to enable a qualified person to sign off on materials management under the DoWCoP is tracking systems, contingency plans and verification plans. Those ensure the robustness of the approach to reusing materials. And it's a qualified person who's independent from the project who reviews all that documentation. They're appointed by the person who is commissioning the project, and they then review all that material, and they're then in a position to make a declaration to Claire, which we verify, and then we pass on a receipt to say, yep, okay, you're good to go to use that material under the DoWCoP scheme. Now, you'll see I've put soil passport in that number 5 box. Well, we've now launched our international soil passport declaration scheme. And this enables folk to use the DoWCoP scheme on projects in any country across Europe, with the agreement for specific projects with the regulator that this approach can be taken. And they would follow the same process as we do in England and Wales. But they would have a soil passport declaration, which enables that material reuse following under the planning permission for that particular project and with agreement of the relevant regulator. So in Scotland, that would be potentially SEPA. And we have been in discussions with SEPA about a more broader approach to this, but at the moment, the international soil passport enables it to be done on a project by project basis. Key thing, as has been mentioned on some of your projects, there is the planning requirements, obviously, and that usually in terms of validation of remediation activity. But for the DoWCoP, the verification report is about the materials use and confirming that the materials were fit for purpose, either from the point of view of chemical criteria or as already been mentioned in some of the treatment activity that you've heard about in the previous talks, from a geotechnical point of view. And they've got to meet both of those, and those criteria relate to the site-specific requirements of materials. So just a quick look across here, we've got the 3 scenarios where we use materials on the site of origin. So that's suitable for soils or for dredge material, for mixed ground, ground-based infrastructure like foundations that have been grubbed up and processed appropriately to make a secondary material, stockpiles of material that exist on the site from previous activities on the site but are on site, are from site of origin, and then you've got the requirement. Sorry, my box is in the way. Using source segregated aggregates, so yeah, that might be sub-base from roads and so on and so forth, but it's already pre-existing on the site and are suitable for reuse on the site. The cluster projects are about use of materials where you have to do a treatment activity, and obviously on when you're not using them on site of origin, they have to go to a treatment facility. Now that treatment facility, as we've seen today, can be on the same site where the materials are dug up, but in this instance we're talking about materials being treated and then sent off site for reuse at an alternative site, or they can be at the receiver site where you treat the materials at the receiver site, having brought them from the original donor site. The only thing we don't do under DoWCoP for transfers between sites is source segregated aggregates, because we have the quality protocols for aggregates in place for those materials, which if you transfer them off site, they should go through that factory production process and become non-waste materials through that route. Direct transfer, again, is for clean, naturally occurring soils, dredgings materials that are excavated on one site and then transferred for reuse on another site. But that is only for clean, naturally occurring materials, similar to the exclusion to the Waste Framework Directive on site of origin, really. And you're not allowed to use those other made ground or ground-based infrastructure and source segregated aggregates in that way. So this is very much the picture we're looking at. We're trying to get people, as we've discussed already today, to make that mental shift from a problem of excavated materials being a waste and a thing to be got rid of, to actually looking at, well, how can we use that material? Where can we use it on site? Can we transfer it to another site where there's a need for materials? How do we avoid discarding it so that we don't have to create a waste material that is then going to landfill site? Soils, particularly on today, the World Soil Health Soil Day, are a valuable natural resource, and we need to make sure that we're using them as best we can, and that requires this sort of mind shift to a circular economy approach to dealing with soils, in the same way that we're trying to use that approach to dealing with other things like metals and so on and so forth that we've been doing for many years. Claire helps that process with its register of materials, so you can register your site if you've got surplus materials, or you can register a need if you've got a requirement for materials, and the web pages help match those up so that people can have a transfer of materials between sites. It's very much about working in a good practice way, and what is collating the project collates the relevant documentation, preferably thinking about soils from early site investigations and early design processes. Then you have the qualified person check. Then Claire process the declarations and issue the soil passport or soil receipt, declaration receipt. We keep things in a secure internal database. We've got the regulatory liaison processes built into the DoWCoP scheme. And we're also doing audits. We do both paper audits of sites that have completed to ensure that they did actually complete in accordance with the plan. And we also are beginning to do site audits. And we have relevant disciplinary procedures available to us if we find that either QPs have signed off something that they shouldn't have done under the scheme, or projects actually haven't followed the plans that they submitted to the QP, and they actually haven't followed the materials management plan. So there's a check process in place there. It's really sort of making sure that projects design accounts for the soil balancing in soil resource plans, and that feeds into the other documents that have been produced recently, the Syria soils and stones document, but more importantly, perhaps coming the DEFRA soil and stones document that will come out to replace the one that was issued in 2009 in the near future. I understand that'll be out in early next year. And then Claire will actually produce a companion guide to that, because we wrote the original basis of that document, which will be a fuller document with more of the sort of background reading on soil science and so on, and a more robust approach to the evidence lines and so on. But it's all about making sure that you've got the right information to make good decisions about what you're intending to do, that you have your tracking procedures in place. It was already talked about, you know, if you end up with stockpiles that have become dumping grounds, or you end up with stockpiles near to each other that are blending materials on the edges, mixing materials, then you haven't got a quality product. So it's really important that things like stockpile management and tracking procedures, taking the relevant samples to create those lines of evidence to go into your verification report, as I outlined in your verification plan. All of these go into creating a project document that means that people can follow those. The qualified person is very much an independent role. They can't be linked to the project. They can't be involved with writing the reports or anything like that. They can be in the same company, but they shouldn't really be linked to the project in any way. More often than not, they're not. There's over 200 qualified persons at the moment in England and Wales who carry out this activity and are suitable for the role, having met the relevant criteria, having the right qualifications, experience, they've passed an examination, and they are chartered. And they're continuing their professional development process. All of those things are required for a QP to become registered with Claire as a QP, and then to act in that capacity to sign off declarations. And they are assessing that all the relevant documentation in the materials management plan, all the bits that sit under that overarching portfolio of documents, meets good practice and meet relevant legislation requirements. And then if that's the case, they can submit the declaration about the reuse of materials as materials rather than as waste. And this is the simple declaration. Basically, once that comes to us, we check it, and then we send out what we call a declaration receipt, or for the international version, the soil passport. And that enables activity to commence on site. So it is a leading international organisation. We've done a lot of work in lots of countries. We've helped Canada develop their soils processing legislation. We're working with Greece and others to try and develop similar schemes there. But it's very much, although the principles are based at the moment in England and Wales, the whole scheme is based on the requirements of the EU Waste Framework Directive. So in many countries, particularly in the British Isles, you will have the same approval setup, the same regulatory setup, and therefore there's no real huge barrier to using the DoWCoP approach in other jurisdictions. Providing you get the agreement from the local regulator, and you can match it into local regulations that are maybe subsets. So for instance, in Ireland, they have a subset of soil regulations. I think in Scotland, you have some soil regulations about transfer of clean naturally occurring materials. The DoWCoP will enable that materials tracking process and that validation process to be robust, and perhaps give everybody confidence in the way that things are currently clearly being done by good projects, but perhaps not by everybody in the way that they perhaps could be. So the opportunity is there to enable projects to use the DoWCoP in other jurisdictions and to show really robust evidence that projects are following a circular economy practice, and therefore increasing the sustainability of construction, not just in terms of reducing traffic movements between sites or off-site for disposal and then on-site for bringing in virgin aggregates. You know, we heard earlier on from Hendrik, I think they say 6,000 lorry movements. That's not just lorry movements, that's not just disruption to the people around on the roads, it's also all those CO2 emissions from lorries and so on and so forth. So circular economy approach to materials management is, under schemes like the DoWCoP, is critical to us moving forward to meet those principles that Sarah outlined earlier on and that we have under the Sustainable Development Governance Goals. So really important that people look at the best practice that's available, and perhaps this is an opportunity to use DoWCoP across a wider piece than we do currently. Just to sort of give you a quick overview of what we've done to date. You can see we've had over nearly 8,500 declarations since the DoWCoP was adopted. Huge amount of material that's been moved. We've got about 200 odd currently qualified QPs. You can see it's ramped up as years have gone by, and you can see on the map where it's been used significantly in the different types of use, either on site of origin or direct transfer and hub and cluster. And obviously direct transfer and site of origin reuse are the key players here, as we've seen in the projects that you've been talked about today. That is the main sort of construction industry activity. As I say, we do carry out audits, both the paper audits, which I've showed the sort of summary here, is that we found pretty much, generally speaking, projects are acting pretty well, and we've got a few that sort of need to improve bits and pieces in terms of their documentation. We don't have that many that currently are showing that they're falling outside the scope of DoWCoP, but as I say, we have disciplinary processes and processes in place with the regulator if that is found to be the case, to bring those projects to book, and if necessary pass them on to the regulator or indeed HMRC to reclaim landfill tax for materials that haven't been deposited appropriately under the scheme. And it's very much about working with regulators as much as we can, and the DoWCoP system works with regulators when they're doing that. That's a best practice mechanism, and it sits under existing planning permissions. So what we're just saying is you don't need to double regulate. If you have a planning permission that's got remediation strategies and so on and so forth as conditions, and soil management conditions, you don't then need to have waste permits, in our view. And that's been a view that's been expressed by the Environment Agency. As I say, the Environment Agency wrote the original document, Definition of Waste Code of Practice on greenfield and brownfield sites, in 2006. That developed out of work that I was involved with for the Channel Tunnel Rail Link, what's now commonly known as High Speed 1. But that was about reusing materials on site in the most pragmatic and sustainable way, and that's what really initiated some of the Definition of Waste Code of Practice approaches. So it enables a regulatory position to be taken on the reuse of materials rather than falling into the formal permitting scheme. I mean, you said, I think the last speaker was talking about 3 to 4 months to get a permit in Scotland. That would be brilliant. In England, I think you'll find many people who would say that would be fantastic. I'm afraid in England it's taking 12 to 18 months to get some of the disposal and recovery permits that are required for construction sites. Excuse me. So we can help with the relevant information exchange and assistance in following up any enforcement activities that might be needed. And we do have these sort of whistleblower processes and fair follow-up procedures for disciplining those who perhaps haven't quite followed the practices they should do. I think it's been mentioned that the Hendrik's project really showed how digital is coming into the construction industry, how to make things transparent and workable, and show that everything is being done to a quality process. Digital is certainly the way forward, and certainly from our point of view, we're suggesting that although digital waste tracking is coming in England and Wales in the not too distant future, we're saying let's not wait for that. There's no reason with the software that's available at the moment, and Hendrik showed that they've got something in place that you can't be digitising these activities now, that your materials tracking can be done by electronic means, and so on, and then that helps us all move towards higher standards and ensuring that we do the activity, and indeed that on-site auditing is also much easier. One of the other things we're looking at is where do we go next, and one of those things has been we've been partly involved in an interreg project with other parties, which is just highlighted on the slide there, about can we use other wastes to actually manufacture materials that could be suitable either as growth media in landscaping or land restoration or habitat rehabilitation or whatever, or even in the case of the French partners that were involved with this, and down at Eden as well on the Eden project, actually growing media for growing particular types of crop or plant, where your soil mix, your recipe needs to be specific to enable a certain type of plant growth. So that's pretty much it. I've galloped through that a little bit. I just wanted to give an overview. You know, we do full days awareness training on what DoWCoP is and whatever. We can do QP training, and you know, hopefully at some point that we'll be able to come up and maybe deliver some of those in the north. But certainly with the international soil passport declaration available now, we hope potentially that it could be used north of the border, as well as it being used south of the border and in Wales. That's me.
That's great. Thank you very much, Jonathan. Can I maybe just ask our other presenters just to come online? I'm just going to stop presenting. Okay. So Gavin is still with us. He's just not able to use his camera today. So
just hiding.
so he is still here to be able to ask some questions. So answer some questions. So we'll kick off with a question for Hendrik. What were your reuse criteria for the soils and the water to safeguard the risks to the River Clyde?
Excuse me, what are the criteria? Or
yeah, what were your reuse criteria?
So we actually, for reuse, it's actually the remediation criteria is 9,600. So that's everything that we have to remediate. So below we can use it if it's not leaching. So that's an important additional criterion. And for the water, we have done an analysis. It's a risk-based analysis. I don't know them by heart, but I can share them if you want.
Thank you. Here's a question I think probably for everyone in the panel. So it's from Ian Hart. It says he was involved in the sector up till about 2000. You can see now that he's retired that where there's been changes over the last 25 years. What do you think are the main opportunities and threats for the future?
I think
we'll start with Jonathan.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in. I mean, we've had some interesting discussions this year, certainly in England and Wales, because of what was in the DEFRA Environment Improvement Plan about creating soil depots, as they call them. I prefer to call them earth banks, where you can make deposits of material that you don't need on the immediate front or can't find a partner to use them, and those materials can subsequently be withdrawn. I mean, these are similar to some of the soil treatment facilities that they have over in the Netherlands and Belgium. And I remember a few years back going over to visit some of the ones over there in Rotterdam, and you know, being hosted by OVAM and others at DEC, and it was really interesting to see how, you know, you can have these fixed soil treatment facilities that can treat materials to create an engineering material that's valid and suitable for use in engineering projects of the right type. And it gets over that problem of we've got material, we need to get rid of it to get on with our timetable, but you know, we don't want to send it to landfill, we don't want to discard it, we don't want it to be a waste, we want it to be reused, but there's no facility. So there is the hope that by 2026 we'll begin to be able to work with DEFRA and regulators to trial some of these, certainly in England and Wales, more akin to the systems that they have in Belgium, for instance.
I think from my perspective, to speak up in terms of threat, it's the disparity in education. We have a very good knowledge share, I think, and a very good driver in a certain sector to make these things work and to try and get reusing soils. But that education piece needs to spread slightly wider to clients, to the house builders, to the developers, so that they can actually see the benefit in planning the time it takes for these processes to take place into their programs for the overall redevelopment, because otherwise we end up in scenarios whereby they want cost, they want time certainty, and at the moment that's very, very difficult to give them with some of these reuse options. So it's getting them on board with that longer term view, and allowing them to plan in and program in doing what we should be doing to reuse these materials.
I suppose my question on that is what how does the Scottish pathway to zero waste and these sorts of endeavours, how does that link with the skills gap and training requirements that are inherent within these processes?
I was going to just add as well with, sorry, was that?
Oh, carry on.
No, I was just going to say this from a local authority point of view. I suppose for a threat that I would see is the conflict of targets. We're all about sustainability, but also councils have got to achieve significant housing targets, and the timescales involved in that don't allow for all that we actually wish for. And I feel as if it's like, as I say, everybody talks about sustainability, but when it comes down to it, so I just feel everybody needs to get on board. I don't know how we do it, it comes from government level, but I feel as if it's very difficult on one hand to try and achieve all that we've discussed when actually there is significant housing targets and demand, and I suppose timescales. It's really down to timescales when it comes to these developments need far longer than maybe they're given, and I know that my colleagues in housing are subject extremely tight within a certain timescale. So the idea of, like, as I suggested, sort of treating in situ soils, it just doesn't fit with our timescales. So I just feel that everybody needs to kind of try and work out. So I don't have the answers, but I would say that's probably the biggest threat that we see. So.
I mean, I was going to ask you, Sarah, to what extent are you actually seeing any sort of soil sustainability considerations in the reports that are coming across your desk? I mean, where are we at as a sector in Scotland, do you think?
Well, as I kind of said, we are getting better on Hendrik's site. That site's obviously sort of the one that I kind of use as an example of how it can be done. A lot of people, unfortunately, I mean, don't get me wrong, some people are trying and they are sort of, and again, it's that discussion, that two-way thing, but we're still seeing a lot of people say the words but not willing to act. It just sort of puts, as long as they mention sustainability in their reports, this kind of thing, then it's sort of, that seems to be we've addressed sustainability, but I just think it just needs, as I say, I'll continue to persevere, and as I say, I've always said, I'm always willing to have early engagement with people, but when we get, quite often, a lot of sites, it's last minute. The reports are issued literally before somebody's going on site, and by that point, everything's been decided. So I suppose it's just, I can't control when I receive a report, but it's just maybe for everybody to then kind of, reports can be written 2 years ahead of what comes across my desk. Why is that? Surely, can we not get that across earlier? And I suppose it's an education, as Gavin was referring to, of developers. It's not just a site investigation. It's not just a desk study. There's a reason it's been done, and actually to get that in early. But yeah, we are getting better. But I think that's just, it's on different, depending on working relationships. And more people I work with in West Dunbartonshire know me now, but we still get a lot of people that just sort of, it's the last minute. And then all of a sudden it's environmental health are holding this up, and it's like, it really isn't. So yeah.
In terms of at the contractor end, Hendrik, I mean, so to what extent do you think that the early contractor involvement element of the Bowling site had an influence on the sustainable use of soils on that site?
I think it had a big influence, and so we were able actually to support the client in the choice of the technique. So we went for the soil wash technique, allowing us actually to reuse that much of soil on site. But not only in the discussion with the client, I think Sarah mentioned as well already, we were involved as well in the discussion with the authorities. So I think that helps as well a lot in the process, and to reuse as much as possible of the soils on site, and to come to solutions for each party, the contractor and the client.
Yeah, I think extending to that point as well. We certainly, in the case of the Glasgow example, while it wasn't formally badged up as ECI, it was a framework that we operate under. So we're actually able to sit down, discuss with the client, look at the benefits of doing the site in the way we intended. And, you know, it was fortunate we didn't have somebody banging the door down to get on and develop the site, or a funder who was looking for recovery or anything like that. So they were able to make the choice to go down the licensing route, where perhaps they wouldn't have been able to if there was more parties involved.
I mean, Gavin, you had mentioned about some of the sort of issues with licensing. So if you had a magic wand, what's the one thing that you would change about the regulatory waste licensing regime that would make your job easier to make sustainability an easier thing to do?
I think certainly Jonathan's presentation covered it. I spent a sort of fairly sizable chunk of time in sort of early 2012, 2013, 2014 working down south. So have seen the benefits to being able to use the DoWCoP. You know, we were able to, back at that time, you know, turn around the documentation required, get the QP sign off very, very quickly, and in a matter of a couple of weeks probably we're able to take material from sites. So that fed in much better to the sort of house builder profile, where they might perhaps be purchasing a site, but as you know, as soon as they've had the capital outlay to buy the site, they want show homes up as quickly as they can. They want all of this stuff happening, and that would definitely facilitate it. I think we encountered probably some knowledge gaps within SEPA, it's fair to say. Not from the point of view of the waste management legislation and that side of things, but actually just industry experience. We, you know, as soon as we mentioned gas, because it's a gas holder, we were sort of, you're getting asked for a demonstration of evidence that there's no longer gas on the site. And you know, I think I sent a couple of photographs of, you know, this is a gas holder in use, this is a gas holder now, it's been demolished, sort of thing. So that knowledge and understanding through to the regulator would also help benefit, I think.
I think
certainly the soil passport moving on is a big plus as I see it.
Yeah, I think certainly in terms of gas work sites that have been remediated and developed in England and Wales, I don't think as many of them would have happened if it hadn't been for DoWCoP. You know, the DoWCoP has been a key facilitator for those sorts of quite complex remediation strategy type sites. And certainly there's been loads and loads of projects over the years, many of them award-winning, that have won awards at various brownfield briefing and so on and so forth, sustainability, development, all that sort of stuff, which wouldn't have happened if DoWCoP hadn't been available to the developers.
Yeah, just out of curiosity, have any sites been through the international passport from Scotland yet?
Not as yet, no. As I say, we're in discussion with both the regulators and one or two others, but as yet we haven't had our first project in Scotland. Well,
maybe someone in this call will be an early adopter then.
I was about to say we'll talk offline about that, Jonathan, for a couple of options.
Yeah, it's all on the website, web pages, and there's a form to fill in, and then we can take it from there.
Brilliant. Well, I think we're going to have to call it there, unfortunately. We should have probably put in half an hour for this discussion. But thank you very much to all of our speakers today. You were absolutely brilliant. Just a reminder that we are going to go straight into our AGM. So if folk can hang around for that, it would be much appreciated. I'm hoping to get that done in 15 minutes. But thank you very much again to all our speakers today.
I'll say goodbye then. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.